Lesson 49, Hangman. To follow along with this lesson, download the project from the top of our lesson page at zoax.net. In this lesson, we explain the code for the classic game Hangman. The code file starts with our header info, inclusion files, and then the function prototypes for the functions in this program. The function definitions are at the end of the file. We will explain these functions as they come up. However, first we want to give a short demonstration of the game's execution. The gameplay is pretty simple. We start with the stand and the word covered up by asterisks. As letters are correctly guessed, they are revealed in the word. If we enter 6 wrong guesses, we lose. Once our game is over, we enter Y to play again. Now if we guess all the correct letters, we win. The overall structure of our program looks like this. At the beginning of the main function, we perform the general initializations such as reading in the word list and seeding the random number generator. Then we have the outer do-while loop, which runs once per game. Inside this loop, we initialize the game variables. For example, this is where we randomly select the word that is to be guessed. Next, we have the inner game loop. This loop runs once per turn until the game is over. So this loop performs turn-based tasks like testing guessed letters and checking for end-of-game conditions. Now let's look at the code again. We begin at the main function. Just as we demonstrated in Lesson 48, we pass in an argument via the project property pages. For our command arguments, we set the value to words.txt. This file contains words separated by whitespace. You can add as many words as you like to the file. Just make sure that you only use whitespace and don't use commas or other delimiters. The file sits in our project directory. At the start of main, we take the file name, which is passed in at index 1 in the argv array, and use this to open the file and read in the words. Our process is a little odd in that we need to first count the number of words so that we know how many string entries to allocate in the array. Then we read the words into this array by calling the readWords function. The functions countWords and readWords are very similar and perform simple file input just as we did in Lesson 47. The only difference between these functions is that readWords stores words into the words array and countWords returns the word count. These functions read one string at a time until we reach the end of the file. The string objects that we are using are STL strings that we covered in Lesson 46. Notice there's a check for an empty string. This is necessary because the program will read the last string before the end of the file as an empty string. Once we get the words into our words array, we seed the random number generator as we showed in Lesson 22. Next, we declare and fill an array of 7 function pointers. These pointers point to 7 functions that show our man in various stages of distress. For the last step of our general initialization, we have a boolean called another game, which is used to control the outer do-while loop that runs once per game. This loop starts at line 45 and ends at line 125. Inside this loop, we have the game initialization. First we choose a random word from our list and set a reference to it. The reference makes our code more readable since it allows us to refer to the string with a more descriptive name and no index. In the next line we use the reference to get the length of the word. After this, we allocate an array of booleans that will correspond to the letters that have been guessed. When a letter is guessed, we will set the boolean to true. So we begin by initializing all of the booleans in this array to false. Lastly, we initialize the variables that will control our inner game loop. These 3 variables are used to indicate the game state and game ending conditions. For example, the game is lost after 6 wrong guesses, or the game is won when all of the letters in the word are guessed. In either case, the game is over and the game over boolean will be set to true to end the main game loop. The main game loop is a do-while loop that runs from line 62 to line 114 and handles each guessed letter. At the beginning of the loop, the screen is cleared and the man is outputted. The remainder of the code in the loop consists of a single if-else-if else statement. The first 2 branches handle the game ending conditions, and the else branch handles the letter guessing case. The else branch first displays the letters of the word that have already been guessed. For letters that haven't been guessed, we output an asterisk as a placeholder. Then we request the next guess and take a char as input. The guess is then tested in our current word, and the booleans are set to true in the guessed boolean array wherever the guessed letter occurs in the current word. The boolean is guessed in word is set to true to indicate the guess was correct. If the guess wasn't in the word, we increment the number of wrong guesses. The wrong guess counter is used for two purposes. It keeps track of which output to display in the display man array and tells us when we are out of guesses and lose the game. This happens when the counter reaches 6. Finally, we test whether all of the letters have been guessed. We do this by initializing guessed word to true and setting it to false if we find an entry in the guessed array that is still false. This last part of the code can trigger either of the game-ending conditions that are handled by the two previous branches that set the game over boolean to true. When the boolean is set to true, the game ends and we exit the inner loop, where we ask the user if he wishes to play another game. If not, then another game is set to false, the outer loop terminates, and the game program ends. Otherwise, we return back to the beginning of the loop and initialize another game. This concludes the lesson.